technical difficulties have been overcome. We are going to welcome Kate Penney Howard here. We're very fortunate to have her join. We're going to make her, thank you. Um,
I
we're
appreciate the fib. The technical difficulty was apparently that I had on my calendar that I was to be in this meeting at noon, which was apparently not correct, and I am very
oh,
apologetic for that. I was out working in the garden, and I'm glad it was so hot because I because I had to come in and I saw the panicked emails, and I was, oh my gosh. I am so sorry.
not a problem. Kate, we're saying that, we are looking forward to your presentation because the Augustan Society has a interest in genealogy, heraldry, royalty,
Right.
nobility, all those history and chivalry, all those things that kind of play out as people do family history. So we figured what we'll
Yes.
do is and just say that you've been breaking brick walls and helping people use a much more modern tool and as a means of doing genealogy. So with that, I think what we'll just do is we'll turn the floor over to you. I think
Thank you so much.
I do think we have a recording going. I think we need to let that be known, right, Jessica? Is that on your end or mine?
I believe that's on my end, and we are recording.
Okay. So well, with that, we'll let you have the floor. And I think everybody's really
Excellent.
excited to hear from you. Thanks for the hot weather is what I'm going to say.
Oh my
There we go.
goodness, it's hot. Thank you so much. My name's Kate Penney Howard. I live near Fort Wayne, Indiana. I'm really glad to talk to your society today. Um, One of the interesting things about my life's path is that I did end up in the Society for Creative Anachronism for several decades of my life. So I'm fairly familiar with heraldry, at least enough to know what bad heraldry is. So I'm really I was really glad to discover that the Augustan Society existed and to, have the opportunity to get to know you all a little bit more. I've been a genetic genealogist for about 10 years. I specialize in working on brick wall cases with DNA. So if somebody had a great great grandfather who kind of came out of nowhere, or he was adopted, or he was born to a single woman, that might be a really good case for DNA and traditional genealogy. So today I'm going to show you a particular path that I was on where I was working on some ancestral brick walls where our colonial origins came into place. I won't tell too many details at this point, but I hope that you have a great reception to this presentation. If you have any questions or comments, you can put them in the chat at any time, and then we'll stop at the end. I'll try to interact with the chat as I can, and we will have a great Q&A afterwards. So thank you so much for inviting me today and for being patient with me. Thank you. So there is no universal understanding of what we mean as genealogists when we say colonial. Historically, in genealogical conversations in the United States, there was a particular understanding which seems to persist fairly strongly, although the language has changed quite a bit over the past century. And if you'll note, the genealogy company family tree on your screen here, I've got a screenshot, and it says, you likely have ancestors who lived in the often overlooked time period between the founding of Jamestown and the battles of Lexington and Concord, so 1607 to 1775. And this language comes from 19th century genealogists who defined colonial ancestors as people who, and this is the important term, settled in the American colonies from the time of the settlement of Jamestown to the Battle of Lexington. And the word settler is a huge distinction because that excludes two very important groups of people who were there. First, the indigenous people who were already in the Americas when the settlers showed up, and two, enslaved Africans who were considered to be property at the time. However, there is another important omission in this concept. They also excluded colonial era ancestors who lived outside of the 13 colonies but lived in the Americas. So, for example, that definition excludes the much earlier settlements of San Juan, Puerto Rico, which was settled in 1508, St. Augustine, which was settled in 1565, Santa Fe, New Mexico, which was settled in 1607, or Port Royal, which is Canada's oldest town, which was settled in 1605. And we seldom talk about the Russian colonization of the Pacific coast, which began with the first trading post in Unalaska, which is in Alaska, and that was in 1774, and Kodiak Island as early as 1784. And from 1812 to 1841, Russia maintained Fort Ross, which was north of San Francisco Bay. And of course, the Spanish weren't very excited about that because they were also busy colonizing the West Coast. So the Spanish and the Russians were clashing on the West Coast. But we don't talk about that very often. And in fact, most areas of the world were either colonized or occupied by another nation, often Europeans. All of the continents of North and South America, Africa, and Australia were colonized. The Middle East and Asia were also divided up by European nations, but while some were colonized, others were subjects of the influence of European countries, and they might own like the rights to minerals or oils or other products. And in China, European countries had what were called concessions, and those were European controlled trade ports. So that's why Shanghai, for example, was able to receive Jewish refugees during World War II, and why my friend, who was born in Hong Kong, has a British passport. I have an ancestor on my mother's side who was transported to Australia in the 1820s during Australia's colonial period. And his children were left behind in England, and he picked up and started a new life once he got to Australia, having more children there. So my transported ancestor is also a colonial ancestor. But for the purposes of today's talk, I'm going to focus on people who lived in North America before the Revolutionary War. That seems to be a reasonable term. So every person is going to encounter different situations when looking at their own colonial ancestors. There are 3 different types of DNA tests that can be used to solve brick wall mysteries. So the first kind of DNA that I'll tell you about is Y-DNA. And Y-DNA is one of the more expensive tests. It is able to follow the Y chromosome, which is passed down from male to male, basically unchanged, but with a few mutations occasionally. The Y-DNA test can reach back thousands of years, 10,000 years. And it is a wonderful tool if you happen to be working on a surname project. So I can see how members of the Augustan Society would be very interested in a surname project if they were working on heraldry for a specific family. So the Y-DNA test can trace back tens of thousands, 10,000 years. However, that makes it very difficult to link 2 individuals with the same name, who may actually be, 10th, 11th, 12th cousins, etc., because those mutations happen, and those are ways that we can mark how far back 2 people are related. But the problem is someone may take a Y-DNA test to figure out who their father is, and their closest match may be somebody where the common ancestor is probably in the 15th century. So It is something that is very hit and miss. And it, of course, only follows the paternal line. So if you have questions about your mother's side, for example, you will not have that available to you. And of course, the most difficult part of Y-DNA is that only people who have a Y chromosome can take the Y-DNA test. So if I were the only person born in my family and my father was deceased, we would not be able to do a Y-DNA test unless we were able to identify cousins who could take that test for us. On the right-hand side is mitochondrial DNA. Mitochondrial DNA is not kept in your 23 chromosomes. It is a different kind of DNA that is in the mitochondria of the cell. Your regular DNA, your autosomal DNA and your Y DNA are in the nucleus of the cell. So in the mitochondria, there are ring-shaped double helixes, which are mitochondrial DNA. And those also can reach back through the maternal line. All mitochondria comes from the maternal line. And it reaches back also about 10,000 years, give or take a few thousand. And you will have the exact same results as you would see in a Y-DNA test. It would just follow the matrilineal line. Both of these tests are quite expensive. Both are available through Family Tree DNA, and that is really the only place that you should test for Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA. Autosomal DNA testing is what you have if you have taken an ancestry test, a 23andMe test, if you have taken a MyHeritage test, or if you have taken Family Tree DNA's Family Finder test. That is this type of test. So you can also upload to Family Tree DNA or to GEDmatch with an autosomal test from one of the other companies. Up until last week, you were able to upload to MyHeritage, but they have changed their rules based on some things that have happened with people violating the terms of service. So for the average North American who is wanting to look at the entirety of their own colonial era origins, comparing your ancestry test against your own known family tree is the best place to start. So everybody is going to run into advantages and disadvantages when they are looking at their own ancestry. For example, if you descend from one immigrant population who stayed in the same place and intermarried, it will be more difficult. Pedigree collapse is something that happens when you have the same ancestors present in your tree more than once. So, for example, if your great grandparents were first cousins, then their parents would be in your tree twice. Well, when that happens, you then reduce the total number of ancestors that we would predict that you would have if you did not have redundancy. And then the redundancy not only limits that particular generation, but then that is reflected exponentially through the more distant generations. So pedigree collapse means that you have the same ancestors present in your tree, but other than those lines, it does not mean that everybody in your tree is related to each other like they would be if they came from the same island or the same small town or the same faith group, for example. Some faith groups are insular. When everybody within a group is related somehow to everyone else, like we see with isolated groups, that is called endogamy, which comes from the Greek marriage within. So we marry within a community, and then that community becomes eventually all related to each other, maybe fairly distantly, fourth cousins, but they're still related, and that is a complication when we get to working with DNA. If your people were affected by conditions such as slavery, poverty, forced removal, famine, war, you name it, all of those things that end up in the history books. There will also likely be disadvantages to proving a colonial ancestor by using DNA. The reason is because when we are in situations like that where basically our lives are in danger, people tend to um, people tend to either make or be the victim of bad decision making. So you have, women who are taken advantage of to one degree or another. You may find that a woman is in a situation where she can only save the family through putting her own body on the line, and there may be a child conceived through that, for example. Um, if your family was forced to move for whatever reason, or if there was a push like a famine or a war, people would often, end up with somebody else's children, or somebody might die suddenly and give their children to their sibling. And so there's a lot of unrest and unknowable things that happen during those flights away from places. Um, and if you have a particularly long line of generations, then you will find that you are lucky enough to find matches who have long generations as well. Those can reach back further into your tree than somebody who had a child at 16, who had a child at 16, who had a child at 16. We're looking for those men who were having children in their 50s, so that we can extend the line down to our time through as few generations as possible. So I'll talk about that a little bit more as we get into the application of it. So I want to give you a case study today. My case study is on my DNA, which is super exciting. Um, it's just as exciting as yours. Uh, so I have done a color-coded fan chart for each of my grandparents who had colonial ancestors. So my paternal grandfather emigrated to the United States my paternal great grandfather and his wife emigrated to the United States in 1907. So I do not have a paternal grandfather fan at all because his family is not colonial. Um, I have, so from the left to the right, I have my paternal grandmother, my maternal grandfather, and my maternal grandmother. What I've done is given each of the countries of origin a particular color. This is going to vary depending upon your ancestors' origins countries. But for me, I have blue for born in the United States, purple for born in Canada, red for born in uh, England, we would say, and green for born in Ireland, light blue for born in Scotland, brown for born in France, and yellow for born in Germany. So I tried to pull colors from the flags that would help me remember. You can pick any color you want. You can have hatch marks in there if you want. It's up to you to create your own system, but this is what works for me. So fortunately, I didn't have too many different countries of origin, so this worked very well for me. So what I did was I marked the birth of each of these ancestors in the color of the country that they were born in. And the pink, sorry, pink is British colonial America. So it is, somewhere, but I had to pick a color, so I decided it was Britain light. So the first is my paternal grandmother. Her father's side were Palatinate Germans, and they were born in Germany, so they are listed in yellow. And then their descendants, who were either the ones in the pie that is closest to the horizon, they had children who were born during the colonial era. The ones who were in the second pie, that other half of my great grandfather, those basically emigrated after the Revolutionary War. So they were born in Germany, and then that couple moved to the United States. So that's why that looks so different. On her mother's side, her grandfather was from England, and was from her grandmother's family was from British colonial America. So looking at my grandmother's um, fan chart, if I were looking to do some research into British colonial America, I might be very interested in using her because she only has 1/4 British colonial American ancestry. So the other, even though her grandfather is from Britain, he wasn't here until the 1870s or something like that. So it's not as it's going to be separated, and it's going to be easier for us to work with that colonial data on this particular example. So this fan is my maternal grandfather, and more than half of his ancestors were colonial American, mostly British, with a little Irish and Scottish and German. So my grandfather, while he is most representative of British colonial America in his particular ancestry, that's not always an advantage because maybe they all were in the same place at the same time and very related to each other. So that is something to keep in mind as we're looking for where we're going to start our project. So this example here is my maternal grandmother. Her father's family were 19th century Bavarian immigrants. If you've heard of Frankenmuth, Michigan, that is the approximate area that they ended up in. And and it is still today a very German community. They did work so hard during World War II that they were named the highest giving per capita of war bonds. So they wanted to make sure that they maintained their German identity, but they also wanted to make it very clear to their neighbors that they were patriotic. So if you look at her other side, though, she does have about 3/8 colonial ancestry there. So there are a few strategies to prove colonial ancestry with DNA. And one of them is to choose somebody who has the least amount of colonial ancestors in their spectrum of ancestors. And in that case, I would use my paternal grandmother's DNA. Like I said, her grandfather or her father was Palatinate German, and her mother's side is English and Irish. So that gives us the most unique sampling and the smallest pool to fish in. You may find plotting the movement, the migration of your ancestors on a map to be helpful. These are the migration patterns of my grandparents' ancestors. My paternal grandmothers are in blue, and my maternal grandfathers are in green, and my maternal grandmothers are in pink. At first glance, this probably looks like quite a bit of a scramble, but it does show something that's very important for genetic genealogy, being that from the early 17th century until the 19th century, the late 19th century actually, my ancestors migrated a lot. And for the purposes of genetic genealogy, this is a great thing because it means that my ancestors were not mixing with each other necessarily. This is the headstone for my first brick wall case. Rufus Hathley is my mother's second great grandfather, and he was a bit of an enigma. I've been obsessed with him since childhood. Our family lore said that he was born of French Canadian fur trappers and native women in Canada. And I know that he was a Union soldier from November 1861 until June 12th, 1865. And he was a prisoner of war for 3 months in the infamous Andersonville prison. After the Civil War, he married Anne Bendel in August of 1865 in Genesee County, Michigan. By 1890, he was disabled by bronchitis, scurvy, rheumatism, piles, and blindness. And his death certificate lists as his father, John Hathley, born in Canada. I'd like to give a shout out to James, who said the powerhouse of the cell for mitochondrial DNA. Yes, that is exactly the powerhouse of the cell. So every genetic genealogist is going to have a different way to describe the steps that you take to break down a brick wall. And my technique, I call it the Tarzan technique, not because I think Tarzan is particularly cool, but because I always want to remind myself that in order to find the solution to the problem at the top of my tree, I need to swing up and out of my tree and over the problem. So I'm thinking about being on a swing set and being pushed and eventually going all the way over. I don't know if that actually happened to me when I was a child, but I was absolutely terrified that it would happen. But this is the way that I solve brick wall cases. So here is Rufus in my mother's family tree. As you can see by the placement of the MRCA icon, MRCA stands for Most Recent Common Ancestor. My mother has cousins who have tested and she has second cousins who have tested on each of these lines. So my mother's line is very well proven by other people who have tested. She has even had third cousins test who descend from Rufus Hathley and his wife, Anne Bendel. And so that is where I want to start swinging in my tree. That's the branch I want to tie my rope to. I want to gather up all of the descendants of Rufus and Anne because they are going to be the key to my next step. And here's a reason why we use the Tarzan technique. So this particular match is a pretty good link, 75 centimorgans. But the problem is this match is from my Hathley family, but she is not only from my Hathley family, she is from my Bone and Hubbard family as well. So I don't want any more DNA in the mix. I don't want any more relatives in the mix than I need. And so that is why I need to swing up as far as I can out of my tree and above my brick wall so I can get a good perspective on it. So we're looking for matches that are not descendant cousins. So descendant cousin comes from the same child of Rufus and Anne as I do. A descendant cousin shares the same descendant from that most common ancestor. What I'm looking for are lateral cousins now. So I'm looking for people who descend from other children of Rufus and Anne that are my lateral cousins. I feel like understanding the different kind of cousins is also a superpower. So you'll want to understand that descendant cousins come from your ancestor who is a child of the ancestor that you're looking at. Lateral cousins come from another child of that same couple. So we need to swing up as far as we can toward our brick wall, and we're looking for matches that are not descendant cousins, but are lateral cousins. So for example, if we had descendants of the children of Mary Hathley and her second husband, Bob Smith, for example, or if Rufus Hathley had another wife that he had children with, if we knew that, that would be a perfect person to use. That would be the best person for us to use. But we don't have that we don't have that in this particular mix. So while you can't trust Ancestry's through lines on its own, it can be a very helpful tool for you to see your matches. Here, Throughline shows that we have matches through 3 of Rufus's children. The children of Mary Hathley are all our descendant cousins, being Bones and Hathleys, and we want to exclude them. And the descendant of Thomas Hathley is rather small, so we're going to exclude her for the time being. And this leaves the descendants of Caroline Hathley, who are our lateral cousins. They only share Rufus Hathley and Anne Bendel with us. So these are the cousins that I am going to focus on in the next phase of my research. So one of the first things that we learn when we start doing genetic genealogy is the Leeds method, which was developed by Dana Leeds. Her website is listed on this page. And if you want to learn more about the Leeds method, you can go to YouTube and search for her videos. She is making new videos every day about the Leeds method and how you can use it. Briefly, the Leeds method is to eliminate any match over 400 because they're going to be too close to you in relationship to be helpful for this process. And then using matches who share between 90 centimorgans and 400 centimorgans, beginning with matches around 200, you begin looking at shared matches and then cluster them until all of your matches for the particular range that you are studying have been assigned at least one color cluster. We are not going to use this exact method to break down brick walls, but we're going to use a modified method, which is necessary because we're working on a subset of your data that's very small. So the numbers that the Leeds method gives us to identify our ancestral clusters is not going to carry over in the same way. They're all going to end up in one cluster if you do it that way. So the good news is if you already know how to do the Leeds method, you already know how to find your brick wall ancestors. You just need the secret, the key. So here we have the two lateral lines descending from the children of Rufus and Anne, who are not my ancestor. These are not large matches, but they are exactly what we need. So I'm going to take the closest match, which is usually also the largest match, the largest and closest lateral match, and I'm going to start looking at their matches. In order to do this, you will need Ancestry Pro Tools, which is one of the best advancements that's been made in the past couple of years for genetic genealogy for this purpose. So the first thing that I'm going to do is to look for matches who only match Anne Bendel's ancestors. Unless there is endogamy or pedigree collapse, which I'm fairly confident we're not going to run into because we know that she came from Michigan while her husband came from Canada. If the matches match Anne, they likely don't match Rufus. So I've marked those matches in common with my highest match, who also have ancestry from my Bendel or Lake lines. I've marked them with a pink B, so I know to exclude them. So here they are in my match list here. There is, however, a 32 centimorgan match who does not have Bendel in her tree. And she is not a match to the Bendel only people that I have excluded. Well, this match is probably who I'm looking for. I'm looking for the third type of cousin. So she is not descendant. She does not come from the same child of the ancestors that I'm working with. She is not a lateral cousin. She does not come from a sibling of my ancestor that descends from the same ancestors. She is likely an ancestral cousin who shares a link to Rufus's father or mother. So this is the person that I am looking for because they may carry that key for me as to who Rufus's parents are. Ancestral cousins are much more difficult to locate because they're going to be hanging out in the low matches. They're going to be between 15 centimorgans and 40, 50 centimorgans. They're going to be hard to find. You really want to hope, again, for somebody who came from long lines of big gaps between generations. So we want to find that last son of the last son of the last son who kept having kids at the age of 50, rather than the 16-year-old who had a child at 16, etc. So I'm looking for more Halfley matches, and hopefully I can find somebody who was born around 1790 to 1820 who would be the right age to be Rufus's parents. So This is where that modified leads method comes in, working with only the shared matches of that match that I had marked with a yellow question mark. I'm going to look to see if I can sort those matches into leads groups as well. But since I'm looking for my mother's third great grandparents, the descendants are going to be approximately fourth great grandparents or fourth cousins or larger. And of course, they won't be straight fourth cousins. They might be something like a second cousin 4 times removed, or a third cousin 2 times removed, or they could be some kind of a half cousin. We don't know until we get in there and start understanding how everybody is related to each other. So what we are certain of, though, is that we're going to need to be looking at people who match us below 200 centimorgans. So if we've done our sorting right and we are not including cousins who come from the same line that we do, and if we don't have a dual relationship with the match, if we're looking for fourth cousins, then we are going to need to look at people who match us below 140 centimorgans. And the conventional wisdom is that we want to stay above 15 centimorgans. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later. But for now, we're looking for matches that are between 15 centimorgans and 140 centimorgans. So let's sort our matches. First, I start by excluding any of the closer matches. Mom's first and second and third cousins, I don't want them in the mix. I only want the cousins that belong to this mystery group that I want to break into subgroups, right? And I use the leads method to break this mystery group into subgroups so that I can then begin to analyze them and figure out which family is connected with each subgroup. So in this case, it looks like 40 centimorgans is going to be my top number. That's pretty small. And I'm going to set my lower boundary at 15 centimorgans, or if I get tired before I get to 15. It depends. Sometimes you'll have a pile of matches and sometimes you'll have 3 or 4. So it just depends what I have if I'm going to keep looking. So I start looking at the matches between 15 centimorgans and 40 centimorgans, and I break them down into color groups. I have 4 color groups. And while I'm doing that, I'm also looking at any trees that people have to see if I can find common surnames. And in this case, they were pretty obvious. So it's very easy to identify the families. And this is a direct screenshot. I've just obscured the names, and then I've put the common ancestor in italics underneath each person. So you can see that I'm definitely coming up with this Pringle name in every single one, and then the Halfley or Hatherley in the other ones, except for the woods match at the bottom, who does not have a tree. If I needed to, I would build a tree for this particular match so that I could see how we were related to each other. But since I have these 5 exceptionally good matches and trees right above them, I'm not going to do that today. So I find John Hatherley, who is married to Matilda Pringle, and I find Frances Pringle and Rue Dibble, or Ruth Dibble. Maybe Frances and Rue are Matilda's parents. I'll just say that for Rue Dibble, there is a huge controversy among genealogists as to whether her name is Rue or Ruth. So both could be possible. Ruth is probably more likely. So let's see what we can find out about John and Matilda. Here's another way that you could possibly swing up your unknown matches. I told you earlier that Pro Tools at Ancestry are particularly valuable. This is the feature that is most valuable to me in Ancestry Pro Tools for this purpose. So if you have Ancestry Pro Tools, you can see not only how much DNA you share with another person, but you can also see how much DNA they share with your other matches. That can come in really handy if you're trying to identify people who don't have trees. So, for example, this is a particular scenario where Mr. Griffiths is a 36 centimorgan match. And using Ancestry Pro Tools, though, I can see that his mother has tested. So she's down there with that purple arrow. And because his mother has tested, but she doesn't have a very good tree, I can use his tree and I can use her matches, which brings me one generation closer to the ancestors that I'm trying to figure out. So that is a particularly useful tool. You may find a young tester who is closely related to somebody who is older or fewer generations from the target. So this is Henry Hathley's death certificate. He is the child of Matilda Pringle and John Hatherley. He is the sibling of Rufus Hathley. He died in 1908, and he gives on his death certificate John E. Hatherley, born in England, and Matilda Pringle, who was born in Canada. So that gives us some help, but this guy John born in England is not, it's not a lot of help. And Matilda born in Canada is not a lot of help either. So we'll take that and hope that we can find more information. In the 1990s, I went to a LDS Family History Center, it was called at the time, I think, and I looked at the microfilms and the indexes, and I remember finding a marriage for a man named Rufus Hathley. I assumed that it must have been, a nephew, grandchild, something like that, because he was 72 years old when this marriage happened. And I knew that he was disabled by his war service. So uh, I was confused as to why he might have married a 40-year-old woman um, at the age of 72. But this is clearly the same person. He also lists his children, his parents, as John Hathley and Matilda Pringle. Um, I was not able to see the microfilm for this particular thing, just the index for it. So I never pursued it because I thought it was ridiculous that he might get married at 72. And besides, I would have known if he had been married more than once, right? Well, this is actually his third marriage. I just didn't know. Um, I can only assume that he did this because he was a disabled veteran of the Civil War, which meant number one, he had a pension to share with a single mother who didn't have a safety net. And number two, he probably needed some help around the house or perhaps a nurse because he was, in fact, disabled. So it's clear that our Rufus Hathley has a DNA link to this couple, John Hathley and Matilda Pringle. So we are looking for connections between Rufus and other Hathleys or Hatherleys, and we use what Elizabeth Schoen Mills calls the friends, neighbors, and associates technique, or FAN technique. Here is Matilda Hathaway on the census, and her daughter Anna, now Shaw, and sons Rufus and Henry living next door to her son Joseph. And even though the last name is spelled incorrectly, we know that this is the same group of people. They are in another census and they are listed together in Find a Grave correctly. So this was just a census enumerator's error. But what about that one match that we looked at that wasn't a Hathley, but was linked to a Pringle and a Dibble? Could that be Matilda's parents? Possibly. So we're going to go and look at our shared matches with her. Yep, I found two matches over 20 with trees that have Francis Pringle and Rue Dibble in their trees. So this is fantastic. We've now identified Matilda Pringle's parents. So let's see if we can Tarzan up another level. And we can. Even though the matches are small, there are a lot of them. This is Francis Pringle's through lines, and this is what a distant ancestor's descendancy often looks like. Since we know Rufus and his siblings emigrated from Canada to Michigan, that adds another layer of hope because migration separates populations for us. And of course, we want to check each match to make sure that they're not related on other parts of the tree, but this is very hopeful. And it just so happens that there is a lot of information out there about Francis Pringle because his father, Joel Pringle Jr., who was born in 1746, is a proven Loyalist ancestor with the United Empire Loyalist Association of Canada. Well, that's the equivalent of the sons and the daughters of the Revolution in the United States, but it's in Canada. Um, and Canada was not on the same side of the Revolutionary War as we were. So I found my colonial ancestors, and they were not patriots. In fact, the people that you see on this page, the patriarch Joel Pringle, or Prindle as he was sometimes called, joined the Royal Rangers, the King's Royal Rangers, together with Joel the Younger and three other sons who fought to keep the American colonies with the British Empire. And the men were away with the army, and so the women and children had to run the farms. They were subjected to much harassment by the rebels, and they were finally forced from their land and had to seek refuge. So they are shown in July 1781 as being on the refugee ration list, and they remained until the close of the war and the final dispersal of the refugees to permanent settlement. This family fled in the middle of the night. 9 families that were connected as an extended family walked from Pound Ridge, New York, which is near the Connecticut-New York border, to the St. Lawrence Seaway and somehow managed to cross. They had one wagon between them, and I'm sure that most people didn't get a chance to ride. And they lost everything in the colonies. Yes, James Howard says it will get you a coronet on your coat of arms. That is true. So Eli Dibble and his wife will also end up leaving Fairfield, Connecticut and moving to Adolphustown in Ontario, Canada, which is where the refugees ended up. Sometime after 1790 and before 1799, when we find the Dibble family living right next door to the Pringle family. And we have DNA matches to Eli and Rachel as well. So then that leads to the question, we're getting kind of greedy now, right? How far back can we go? Can we get to Charlemagne with this DNA? I don't know. But no, you can't. You can, but you won't be able to tell. Each one of you probably does carry some DNA from Charlemagne, but we won't be able to identify it. So how far back can we really go? I'm going to look at my dad's DNA for a minute. Remember, I told you that researching his DNA for colonial ancestors might be advantageous because his father was born of immigrants and his mother's father was colonial German, and his mother's mother, her father was British and her mother was English colonial in heritage. While I have not been able to document and DNA prove all of her lines, she is going to be an interesting place to start because we don't have a lot of branches to swing on. However, I need to keep in mind that there are 3 large swaths where I don't have information and it could be misleading to me. So here is my father's 6th cousin. He is from a different part of the country of the United States than my father is from, and he has a fairly good tree. This person actually moved all the way out west, which it makes me very happy because my family's from Michigan. So if I find a match who has moved away a long time ago, I am very, very happy to work with that particular match. So he also has a fairly good tree, which also makes me happy. And looking at the tree and looking at the matches, this match looks like maybe somebody I can swing further back with. So I isolate his matches and I start to look for not descendant, not lateral, but ancestral cousins that are related to this individual. And I find them. In fact, I find a match who shares a ninth great grandparent with my father. So the Macumber is a kind of an interesting name because it actually morphs from Macomer, Macomber, to McCumber, MC, capital C, Umber. So it goes from an English name to like a Scottish name or an Irish name, which is kind of an interesting morphing. So one of the matches shares a ninth great grandparent set with my father. They are on paper 10th cousins, and they share 17 centimorgans in one segment. So that is a real match. It is about as small as you can get, but it is real and it is solid. They have to share an ancestor with each other. So does this prove that this DNA belongs to William Macumber, who was born in 1610 in Devonshire, England, and his wife Priscilla Ursula Thomas, who was born in 1618 and who settled in Plymouth Colony by 1640? Does that prove that? Well, we go back to look at this and we can say, well, it does prove that we have a connection with that particular ancestor and that this person alleges to descend from that particular ancestor. And we do share DNA with this person. However, it could come from one of these white areas in that ancestor's fan. So we can't say conclusively, but we can say this certainly is a very interesting theory that we are going to continue to look at. It does not prove that the DNA belongs to that particular ancestor, but it suggests that it could. And I do want to remind you again, my dad's DNA is particularly interesting. This is something that we haven't talked about yet, but when one group immigrates, they leave people behind. And immigration has been happening for a long time to North America. So it's possible that branches or even ancestors could have immigrated. Remember, I told you that one of my immigrant ancestors is a person who was forcibly transported to Australia, leaving his children behind. I don't descend from anybody born in Australia, but I do descend from someone who died in Australia, if that makes sense. So his children continued to be in Great Britain until their children emigrated at some point. My ancestors immigrating in 1907. So, for example, here's some more really weird immigration patterns from my colonial ancestor or my late arriving ancestors. So, if you look up my Scottish great grandmother, she is a Morrison, and she is born to a long line of Hugh Morrisons. Hugh Morrison, born in 1808, he was actually died in Iowa. He emigrated with some of his family, leaving Hugh Morrison, born in 1833, behind. So he emigrated with his younger children to Iowa. So I have fairly decent cousins in Iowa that, we have like I contact them and say, "Do you know how we're related?" And they have no idea. But it turns out that their Hugh Morrison, who emigrated in 1808, is my great grandmother's ancestor. So even though my great grandparents didn't make it out of Northern Ireland and that bit of Scotland right across the channel until 1907, their DNA made it out a long time before they did. That's what's important to understand. So your DNA only tells the story of your family, your ancestors, but your match's DNA may tell the story of what happened to their ancestors up to the common ancestor. So is it possible that that 17 centimorgan match proves these people born in the first quarter of the 17th century? 10th cousins by autosomal DNA. The big key with the 17 centimorgan match is that it is one segment. That proves the shared DNA is what we call identical by descent. And geneticists theorize that we all have short and old identical by descent segments in common ancestral groups. So in my family, where I see these short, old, identical by descent segments are the settlers of Plymouth Plantation and the settlers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That happens to be a place where a significant number of my ancestors come from. So there are studies that show that the majority of the identical by descent shared segments in the 5 to 20 centimorgan range are from ancestors greater than 10 generations back. So, for example, that cousin who I showed you, who's a 10th cousin to my father, would be part of this majority of identical by descent shared segments in 5 to 20 centimorgan range are from ancestors greater than 10 generations back. And then the same study tells us that blocks longer than 4 centimorgans, but under 10 centimorgans, come from 500 to 1500 years ago. So while we have DNA that connects us back 1500 years, it's not going to be something that at least my brain is going to be able to connect back. Plus, we deal with the problem of false positives as we go down below 10 centimorgans, as we go down further than that. The reliability just drops precipitously below 15 centimorgans. So this is where I have to caution everybody against puzzle piece smashing. We know we have DNA in common with people that show up on our match list, right? So it's certainly part of the puzzle. It just may not go right there. And if you, like me, might be that kind of person who would either peek at the box top or perhaps shove that puzzle in where it doesn't quite match because you're impatient, like me, we have to accept that there's a bottom for what we can accept as proof. So the prevailing guidance is above 15 centimorgans on one segment is over 99% probability a true match. If you were really careful, you could even scooch it down to about 10 centimorgans because that is still over 90% probable. But you just have to be honest with yourself and be cautious because just like if we're working with a fragment of a document, right? We might not know exactly what we have. We might not know what a letter is really about if we don't know both sides of the story, if we don't have the entire document. So here is an image from the DNAgeek.com. Dr. Leah Larkin is very good at explaining this. If you are interested in explaining how DNA is passed down from person to person or how we can use it to identify relationships, that's definitely a really awesome, nerdy place to go to see this laid out for us in ways that we can understand. So this is showing us how a distant ancestor may give a small amount of DNA to an ancestral population where person A and person B might share the endogamy of the distant ancestor, that first person to step on Plymouth Rock, for example, versus the recent ancestor who may have been born right around the time of the Civil War. So you've got all of this intermingling that happens between the colonial era and the middle of the 19th century. So that doesn't mean, though, that 6 to 15 centimorgan matches are false. It just means that they may not be true. Because you may have an incident where, because we only have a few different variables in DNA, it's possible to accidentally assemble by laminating together two unmatching, two unrelated sets of DNA that just happen to have the same data here and the same data here. And then when we stick it together, it kind of looks like a bigger match, but it really isn't. So that's a false positive. So how about you? How can you use what we have talked about in this past hour to advance your own genealogy? Well, develop a hypothesis. I tend to encourage people to go for that thing that you're most curious about, that thing that you really most want to know. Come up with a theory and use DNA to test your theory. You might find the chromosome browsers on 23andMe, GEDmatch, and MyHeritage to be useful to you. But I would suggest first using the DNA Painter tool, What Are the Odds, or Banyan DNA, and build your descendancy tree in there and add all of the matches that you can and run the predictor to see if your hypothesis is correct. And then look for more resources because you never know when you might have looked over the resources that you needed because you assumed that your ancestor didn't get married a second or a third time, especially not at 72 years old. And if you had just trusted the resources, you might have known, you might have had the information that you already needed. So what if you try all of this and it doesn't work for you? My first piece of advice is to throw everything away and start over again. Now, you can throw it away by putting it into an envelope and sealing it, but what I like to do is see if I come up with the same conclusion using the same resources if I try again. So waiting until it's gone from your brain and then scrapping and starting over the whole project is a way to do it. Another way to do it is to scrap it and give it to a friend and have them do the work. Maybe if you trade projects with another person, that's a great way to get some free help. You can reevaluate everything that you know. For example, surnames can be a problem. If you're from a culture that has a different kind of surname inheritance than the patrilineal surname inheritance that I happen to be used to, you may have a challenge with DNA. When I work with Scandinavian DNA, it's almost always endogamous, but also we have that naming pattern where everybody gets named child of so and so. And so, whether it's a son of or a daughter of, those names change every generation. And so, there's not a way to follow that back. You have to look for the exact same ancestors rather than being able to trace a surname back. So, it's harder, but it's not impossible. And first names can be a problem too. So you'll want to pay attention to naming conventions that were important in the time and place and culture that your ancestors were living. Well, that is all that I have to present, but I bet that there are lots of questions and comments to be shared.
Thank you, Kate, for that, and thank you also for the details. Wow. I think it's going to be one of those we load these to our YouTube channel. I'll probably watch this one a couple of times to get through.
Yep. Yep.
It is helpful to understand that Pro Tools and that is an additional subscription cost, right? When you're using that type
Yes,
of
it's $10 a month.
okay.
So I find that to be, I would get rid of a streaming service if I had to choose between Netflix and Pro Tools. I would get rid of Netflix.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's a pretty high endorsement there.
Yeah.
I think what we want to do is see if people have the opportunity, if they have questions, to see if we can bring folks off mute so they can do that. I see some in the chat. Folks were really enjoying this and appreciative of your talents and sharing those with us. Does
Thank
anybody have
you.
any questions they want to ask? I'm not seeing any, so.
Alvin points out that many Civil War veterans married or remarried later in life. Yes, they did. For the exact same reasons that, that I conjectured. That pension was really great for the two women. My ancestor married two divorced women with children. So that was clearly a social assistance. He probably was not romantically in love. It was probably a way for everybody to get along better. And he clearly, he wasn't able to take care of himself. So he needed a nurse just as much as she needed a provider.
Yeah. And I like the cornet reference. My kids have both DAR and UEL. And
Do they?
at one point, the two relatives literally lived across the river from each other. They
Yes.
didn't know each other, which I
Yeah.
thought was fascinating. So, uh,
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing when you go back into this. I also really appreciated your intro about colonial. I think that is really helpful, especially living on the West Coast. When I teach history in my for the adjunct role I have with a local community college, we talk quite a lot about everything's just not 13 colonies. There's this other stuff going on, but we gotta go pay attention to that because that gives us certain things that happen that
Yeah.
in today. But it's really good in that regard. Folks, if there's no other questions, I'm going to suggest that we end this meeting. For those who attended, thank you for our speaker. I'm just going to do a round of applause. That was
Thank you so
fascinating.
much.
And we will have this hosted up on our YouTube channel here. Dame Jessica and I will work on getting that done here in the next week. So we really appreciate it, Kate. Thank you. And I
Thank
hopefully gave
you.
you a reprieve from the sun and the garden. So
Yes, you did. Thank you so much. And I apologize again for my tardiness.
not a problem. I think people enjoyed it. Thank you and
Thank
take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right, folks. I think I'm going to close out the meeting and hopefully everybody enjoyed. At least I'm going to head out. And Jessica will start doing this, and I'm glad everybody came and participated. We really appreciate that. And again, go look over at that YouTube channel. Let me just see if that's still in my. Yep, I'm going to post that one more time so you can click that if you want to go see what else we have over there. And Jessica and I will work. We'll get